This video is sponsored by War Thunder. For days, a deceiving lull had settled over the battle lines in southern Okinawa. Pinned before the formidable outer defenses of the Shuri Line, the exhausted men of the American 24th Corps waited, tense, anxious, and thick with anticipation. Ahead of them loomed a labyrinth of fortified hills and ridges, defended by determined Japanese soldiers they could not even see, but whose deadly resistance they knew all too well. Now, as final preparations were made for the descent back into that brutal killing zone, one thing was certain: the next assault promised a bitter fight, on the same ground where they had already bled. By mid-April, the battle for Okinawa had taken on a clear shape. The U.S. 10th Army, under General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., had landed 2 weeks earlier and rapidly secured the central portion of the island. In the north, the 6th Marine Division of Major General Roy S. Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps encountered only light resistance as it advanced through the island's mountainous spine, while the 1st Marine Division held the central plain, securing critical roads and staging areas. But in the south, progress had slowed to a crawl. Here, Major General John R. Hodge's 24th Corps faced the bulk of the Japanese 32nd Army, entrenched within an elaborate system of defenses stretching from Uki Village on the east coast to Makinato Inlet in the west, anchored to a natural fortress of ridges, escarpments, and bunkers that formed the outer edge of the Shuri Line. And it was here, in this crucible of terrain and resistance, that the decisive struggle for Okinawa would unfold. Within just a few days of the initial landings, there were clear indications that the Japanese had concentrated most of their forces in the south and intended to make their decisive stand there. This became brutally apparent as American troops pushed further inland, resistance stiffened, casualties mounted, and the momentum of the offensive quickly ground to a complete halt. Confronted by this powerful, stubborn defense and the resulting stalemate, General Buckner moved to reinforce the embattled front. Thus, he ordered the immediate deployment of the 27th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General George W. Greiner, Jr., which had been waiting offshore as the floating reserve, to reinforce Major General Hodge's hard-pressed 24th Corps. On April 9th, the soldiers of the 27th began landing at the Hagushi beaches, and within a few days, the division was moving south to join the main effort. By April 15th, the 27th had taken over the right flank of the 24th Corps' line from the battle-weary 96th Division, which was shifted further toward the center of the Corps' front. In addition to the arrival of the 27th Division, the other two divisions of the 24th Corps, the 7th, commanded by Major General Archibald Arnold, and the 96th Division, under Major General James L. Bradley, received approximately 1,200 replacements. Now, with 3 divisions under his command, General Hodge, convinced that an all-out effort was necessary to penetrate the 32nd Army's lines, scheduled a new attack with all 3 divisions abreast for April 19th, and this time there were no surprises, as the Americans knew exactly what brutal fight that lay ahead. Since April 8th, 24th Corps had struggled to break through the heavily fortified Shuri Line and drive out Japanese forces entrenched on dominating hills and ridges. The 96th Division launched repeated but unsuccessful assaults against Kakazu and Tombstone Ridge, while on the Corps' eastern flank, the 7th Division faced stiff resistance around the village of Uki and the ridge complex known as Skyline Ridge. The sheer strength and depth of these defenses led to intense, costly fighting, and as progress gradually ground to a halt, the offensive had effectively stalled by mid-April. Adding to the mounting challenges of this stalled situation, a fierce Japanese counterattack on the night of April 12th caused further disruption of American efforts and forced a temporary pause in the advance. By April 14th, both sides were already severely exhausted after days of relentless combat, and a brief lull followed, one that both the Americans and Japanese used to regroup, reinforce, and prepare for the next phase of battle. With a grim appreciation of the difficulties ahead, General Hodge planned his renewed offensive to achieve a decisive breakthrough against the intricate Japanese defense system around Shuri and seize the low valley and highway stretching across the island between Yonabaru and Naha. His plan called for the 7th Division, positioned on the 24th Corps eastern flank to capture the village of Uki and the surrounding hills and ridges in their sector, before pressing south towards the area between Shuri and Yonabaru. In the center, the 96th Division, spearheaded by the 381st and 382nd Regiments, with the battered 383rd Regiment held in Corps Reserve, was tasked with driving straight through the heart of the Japanese defenses, seizing the town of Shuri itself, and advancing as far as the highway beyond. Perhaps the most challenging assignment fell to the 27th Division on the western flank. The 27th's mission was to advance through a narrow corridor bounded by Makinato Inlet to the west and the Kakazu Hill Mass to the east, across a low, flat plain covered with rice paddies and dissected by streams. This ground offered little cover, leaving the troops fully exposed to Japanese observation and fire. Moreover, before beginning to execute their mission, the division first needed to establish a bridgehead across the Makinato Inlet, then swing east to capture Kakazu Hill and the village of Kakazu. From there, the plan called for a push south through this narrow zone, breaking through the western edge of the Shuri Line defenses, with the outskirts of the city of Naha as their final objective. During the lull, there was virtually no change along the front lines, and the fighting was limited to patrols and searching for weak spots in the Japanese line. However, while the front line remained momentarily still, there was no rest behind it. Day and night, long convoys of trucks rumbled along dusty roads, hauling ammunition and supplies from the beaches to forward artillery and infantry positions. The sheer scale of the logistical effort was aptly captured in General Hodge's remark that the coming assault would be 90% logistics and 10% fighting. In the meantime, the Japanese were anything but idle in the days leading up to the American assault. Anticipating the inevitable attack, they worked without pause during the lull in fighting to repair damaged fortifications, reinforce existing positions, and prepare reserve defensive points into which troops could quickly move from caves and tunnels once the shelling subsided or the ground assault commenced. Aware that the offensive would almost certainly begin with a heavy artillery bombardment, unit commanders ordered their troops to remain sheltered in caves and underground positions at all times, ready to emerge only when the assault began in earnest. Additional support weapons, particularly anti-tank guns, were brought forward to key positions, and routes were cleared to enable rapid movement of reinforcements from protected rear areas to the front line. Furthermore, to reinforce their depleted frontline strength, the 63rd Brigade of the 62nd Division was supplemented with elements of the 272nd Independent Infantry Battalion from the 64th Brigade and the 22nd Regiment from the 24th Division, both of which had suffered heavy losses during the failed counterattack earlier in April, but remained in place along the line. After days of feverish preparation, by April 18th, everything was in place for General Hodge's impending offensive. The 105th Regiment of the 27th Division, having secured Sugen-shima, had arrived on Okinawa and taken up positions between the 106th Regiment on the far right flank and the 381st Regiment further east, allowing the 96th Division to narrow its zone of action. Yet one can only speculate how the 24th Corps' attack might have unfolded given how much depended on the 27th Division's ability to advance across open terrain, fully exposed to Japanese forward observers, and then secure an adequate bridgehead across the Makinato Inlet, had it not been for the ingenuity of the division's commander, General Greiner. After studying a captured Japanese document stating, "The enemy generally fires during the night, but very seldom takes offensive action," Greiner devised a bold plan. Rather than attack during daylight, he proposed launching a surprise night assault, hoping the unexpected timing would catch the Japanese off guard and improve the chances of advancing across the fire-swept ground. But before we dive deeper into the events on Okinawa, here's a quick word from today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, now free to play on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, Android, and iOS. Take command of over 2,500 incredibly detailed vehicles, tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 major nations, spanning the era of biplanes of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. War Thunder delivers intense, realistic combat with stunningly detailed vehicles, lifelike graphics, and authentic sound. And it isn't an average shooter. War Thunder features the most advanced damage models in gaming. Every shot can disable a specific component: fuel tanks, engines, even crew, all modeled in stunning detail. And when a vehicle goes down, X-ray view shows you exactly how it happened. Whether you're playing on a console, computer, or an all-new mobile version, War Thunder delivers intense, full-scale battles with intuitive controls and top-tier graphics. With 3 game modes, arcade, realistic, and simulator, there's something for every kind of player, whether you're looking for fast action or full immersion. Customize your vehicles with historical camo, authentic markings, and community-made skins to make them truly your own. Best of all, War Thunder is heavily optimized for smooth gameplay, and you don't need extra hardware. Just a mouse, keyboard, or controller works great even in simulator mode. Click the links in the description to claim a massive bonus pack, including the exclusive Eagle of Valor decoration, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account available for all new and returning players who haven't played for at least 6 months for PC and consoles. Join over 70 million players and experience the most intense military combat game out there. Play War Thunder for free today. Thus, the opening move in what would soon escalate into a full-scale assault across the 24th Corps front began quietly but decisively on the afternoon of April 18th. At 4:30 p.m., under the cover of a thick smoke screen and without the usual artillery preparation, Company G of the 2nd Battalion of the 106th Regiment crossed the Makinato Inlet in assault boats and swiftly scaled the cliffs on the opposite shore. Fortunately for the Americans, this area was only lightly defended. Having caught the defenders off guard, Company G advanced rapidly, clearing out Japanese positions, and by nightfall, American troops had seized control of Makinato village. Sporadic skirmishes and scattered firefights continued into the night, and by midnight, most of the Japanese outposts on the inlet's southern shore had been cleared. The success of Company G immediately cleared the way for the most critical phase of the operation: the construction of 4 bridges across the Makinato Inlet by the 102nd Engineer Combat Battalion. To avoid tipping off the Japanese to the plan of crossing the inlet in strength, the engineers had deliberately avoided stockpiling bridging equipment near the front lines. Instead, in the days leading up to the assault, they prepared their components in rear areas, keeping them ready for rapid deployment. Pontons were inflated, and bridge sections were pre-assembled to the maximum size trucks could carry. Once the inlet's far shore was secured, under covering mortar and artillery fire, the engineers began the construction. Working through the night, they completed a 120-meter footbridge by midnight, followed by 2 Bailey bridges by 3 a.m., achieving an impressive accomplishment under combat conditions. However, the construction of the ponton bridge proved more troublesome. A strong outgoing tide pulled away several floating sections and its anchor line, delaying its completion until midday on April 19th. As soon as the footbridge was completed, under cover of darkness, the remainder of the 106th Regiment, along with the attached 27th Reconnaissance Troop, crossed the Makinato Inlet, and throughout the night, a steady stream of troops trudged over the newly finished span. Once they had crossed the bridge, elements of the assault companies, still undetected by the Japanese, had advanced nearly a kilometer through the darkness and assembled at the northwest base of the Uraso-Mura escarpment, preparing to launch their attack at first light. It was already dawn when the men of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions began scaling the heights. Without being detected, they reached the crest by 7:10 a.m., when soldiers from the 2nd Battalion stumbled upon a group of Japanese troops cooking breakfast, finally triggering an alarm. Now alerted, the Japanese put out limited resistance, but in half an hour, the 2nd Battalion secured the crest, and the rest of the regiment moved up to consolidate and expand the foothold on the escarpment. The 27th Division's assault had begun with a promising success, but elsewhere along the front, the battle was now erupting in full force. Dawn on April 19, 1945, broke over southern Okinawa not with the soft glow of morning light, but with the earth-shattering roar of hundreds of cannons. Beginning at 6 a.m., 27 battalions of artillery, 9 of which were Marine, opened fire with a total of 324 pieces, unleashing the most intense barrage of the entire Pacific War. For 40 minutes before the first assault waves moved forward, over 19,000 shells rained down across the Japanese front lines. Adding to this firepower, 6 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 6 destroyers of the Fifth Fleet pounded the Japanese defenses from the sea, creating a combined density greater than one weapon, firing into every 25 meters of the front. At the same time, 650 Navy and Marine aircraft either flew close-up air support for the waiting troops or punished the Japanese rear with rockets and bombs. Furthermore, as part of the calculated deception, after 20 minutes of sustained pounding, artillery fire deliberately shifted to the Japanese rear areas for 10 minutes, intending to lure defenders from their deep underground shelters before abruptly returning to hammer the front lines again. Yet, despite the seemingly impossible odds of survival in such a bombardment, remarkably, most of the Japanese survived the preparation largely unscathed. Even Brigadier General Joseph R. Sheets, commander of 24th Corps Artillery, later expressed skepticism, estimating that regardless of the tremendous volume of ordnance expended, out of roughly 4,000 battle-hardened veterans of the 62nd Division holding the line, no more than 190 were likely killed by the artillery barrage, or 1 for every 100 shells. Still, the sheer scale of the bombardment had some initial effect. At first, assault troops from the 7th and 96th Divisions made some gains, but as Japanese soldiers scrambled from their shelters and rushed to reoccupy their positions, the American advance began to lose momentum and soon ground to a halt. On the extreme left of the Corps front, the 32nd Regiment of the 7th Division, deployed with all 3 battalions in line, launched an assault supported by 2 standard and 3 newly arrived flame-throwing tanks. Their primary objective was the knife-edged high ground known as Skyline Ridge, held by the 11th Independent Infantry Battalion of the Japanese 63rd Brigade. For 15 intense minutes, the tanks surged through the village of Uki, firing and spewing flame into clusters of Japanese positions, pushing as far as the base of the ridge. At 7 a.m., assault companies moved up swiftly, reaching the forward slope and beginning to climb toward the crest of Skyline Ridge. But as the supporting artillery fire lifted, the Japanese defenders suddenly sprang to life. From dugouts on the reverse slope, infantry surged forward, taking up positions along the narrow spine of the ridge. Now the momentum shifted, and it was the Japanese who were attacking. Mortar fire, precisely zeroed in beforehand, rained down on the advancing Americans. Then, in a fierce and chaotic counterstroke, waves of screaming Japanese troops poured over the crest, charging from the reverse slope, some even running through their own mortar fire, hurling grenades and satchel charges as they came. Twice they launched ferocious counterattacks, and each time the American troops clung tenaciously to their hard-won foothold on the forward slope, only to be forced to withdraw from the lower end of Skyline Ridge under overwhelming pressure. On the division's right flank, the 2nd Battalion of the 184th Regiment launched an assault westward toward the division boundary, aiming to capture Hill 178, the highest point on Skyline Ridge's western edge. The advance progressed until around 7:30 a.m., when the battalion entered the Japanese defensive zone and came under intense fire from 2 coral knolls, soon dubbed the Rocky Crags. These positions dominated the approach to the Tanabaru escarpment, and from them, the Japanese troops unleashed withering enfilade fire from mortars and machine guns, pinning the Americans to the exposed ground. Throughout the day, the 2nd Battalion remained trapped in this deadly crossfire, unable to move forward. Shortly after 4 p.m., the unit was forced to withdraw to its original positions, having gained no ground. Meanwhile, in the center of the 24th Corps front, the 96th Division faced an even more challenging task that would ultimately prove even more frustrating than the one endured by the 7th Division to their left. Assigned to push through some of Okinawa's most rugged ground and expertly prepared defenses, the division aimed to capture a series of dominating terrain features in the heart of the Japanese defensive line positioned along Tombstone Ridge, the Tanabaru Escarpment, and Nishibaru Ridge, before pushing on toward the even more formidable Uraso-Mura Escarpment. Holding this sector was the 12th Independent Infantry Battalion, reinforced by the remnants of the depleted 14th Independent Infantry Battalion and supported by units from the 1st Light Machine Gun Battalion, deeply entrenched in a maze of interconnected tunnels and fortified strongpoints. The 382nd Regiment, attacking east of Kaniku Village with 2 battalions abreast, advanced roughly 500 meters before being halted by a withering hail of machine gun and rifle fire from a heavily fortified Japanese stronghold on Tombstone Ridge. Although some units reached the ridge's crest, they were unable to break the determined defense, and by day's end, the regiment held only a precarious foothold along the northwest nose and a portion of the west slope of the ridge. At about the same time, the 381st Regiment, advancing from positions just north of Kaniku, moved through the western part of the village and pushed into open ground. Despite coming under intense fire from both Tombstone and Nishibaru ridges, the 381st managed to gain approximately 300 meters, reaching the northern face of Nishibaru Ridge. However, the volume and accuracy of Japanese fire soon made further progress impossible, and by late afternoon, forward elements were forced to pull back to their original positions without gaining any ground. On the right flank, the 27th Division's operations met mixed results. Although the 106th Regiment's night infiltration had initially succeeded in gaining substantial ground, the division's progress during daylight proved far less effective. On the western edge of the Uraso-Mura escarpment, what began as light resistance early in the day quickly intensified as Japanese forces, concealed in reverse slope positions, fought tenaciously and halted the 106th Regiment's advance. On the division's left flank, however, the 105th Regiment faced its own daunting challenge, capturing Kakazu Ridge, a position whose formidable defensive network had already stalled the 96th Division's advance for more than a week, and which proved no less tough for the 105th to take. At 7:30 a.m., with artillery preparations still underway, the 105th Regiment, supported by approximately 30 tanks of the 193rd Tank Battalion, began its attack, with the 1st Battalion leading the way. Deployed along Kakazu Ridge, the 1st Battalion launched a frontal assault. Yet, as soon as they crossed the gorge before the ridge, they were pinned down in the open by an overwhelming storm of mortars and machine gun fire. With the 1st Battalion completely halted, the 2nd Battalion was ordered at 9:07 a.m. to move up along the division boundary at the extreme left, through the cut between Kakazu and Nishibaru ridges. This area was perhaps the most strongly defended part of the Japanese line, where they had massed high concentrations of mortars, machine guns, anti-tank guns, and anti-aircraft cannons to cover the crucial road through the cut. Once again, the infantry failed to advance across the open field under murderous fire from surrounding ridges. The tanks, however, kept rolling. Cut off from their accompanying infantry, they quickly became easy prey for the Japanese, who had precisely anticipated a tank attempt to penetrate their lines between Nishibaru and Kakazu ridges and had prepared meticulously. American tanks were lost one by one along the way, destroyed by mines, hidden anti-tank guns, and swarms of infantry armed with satchel charges that turned the corridor into a death trap. Despite these devastating losses, some tanks pressed on through the cut, swung in behind the ridge, and blasted through Kakazu, demolishing what little remained of the village. But without accompanying infantry to hold ground, the tanks had no choice but to withdraw. Of the 30 tanks that had maneuvered around the left end of Kakazu Ridge that morning, only 8 returned in the afternoon. The loss of 22 tanks in the Kakazu area on April 19th was the greatest suffered by American armor on Okinawa in a single engagement. While a majority of the tank crew members survived the initial disablement, many were subsequently killed. Nevertheless, some crew members from destroyed tanks successfully hid within the ruined village, remaining there for days before being rescued by advancing American forces. Meanwhile, as casualties continued to mount, and the 105th Regiment's advance completely stalled, Colonel Walter S. Wynne, the regimental commander, ordered his battalions to exploit the success of the 106th Regiment by attempting to move around the west end of Kakazu Ridge. Consequently, by late afternoon, having suffered 158 casualties, the 105th Regiment abandoned the entire Kakazu Ridge front and shifted its position southwest of the village, linking up with the 106th in front of the Uraso-Mura escarpment. This redeployment, however, created a significant gap of nearly 1 kilometer between them and the right flank of the 96th Division. The opening day of General Hodge's offensive had delivered little cause for optimism. 24th Corps had suffered 720 casualties, including killed, wounded, or missing, while gaining only minimal ground. Still, despite this disappointing beginning, sheer determination would soon begin to yield results. Following a half-hour of artillery preparation at 7:30 a.m. on April 20th, the 24th Corps resumed its slow, grinding advance. On the extreme west, the 27th Division pressed forward along the coast. That morning, Colonel Gerard Kelly's 165th Regiment, brought up from the division's rear, passed through the line of the 106th Regiment, which was still engaged in mopping-up operations on the reverse slope of the Uraso-Mura escarpment, aiming to push further south. The 165th's mission was to capture the village of Gusukuma and continue toward the Makinato airfield. However, their progress quickly stalled against tenacious defenses held by the Japanese 21st Independent Infantry Battalion, part of the 64th Brigade, who had established a formidable defensive complex dubbed by the Americans the Item Pocket. Named after the letter I, or in military terminology known as Item Grid Square on the American tactical map, this fortified zone consisted of a series of low but dominant limestone ridges, each separated by gullies and rice paddies that favored the defenders. Over the next week, the 165th Regiment was drawn into a brutal close-quarters combat across this broken ground. Though localized, the fight for the Item Pocket vividly reflected the intensity, frustration, and savage brutality of the wider 24th Corps campaign on Okinawa. Meanwhile, the 105th Regiment, with its 2nd and 3rd Battalions, pushed eastward to clear the Uraso-Mura escarpment. This task, however, would prove far more difficult than anticipated. During the night of April 19th to 20th, the Japanese 64th Brigade took over the western sector from the shattered 63rd Brigade, extending its line as far east as Nishibaru. As a result, what had begun as a clash between a reinforced Japanese brigade that tied down an entire American corps composed of no fewer than 3 divisions, now escalated into a full-scale engagement between a corps and a division. As soon as the 105th pressed forward, its progress was promptly halted by intense fire from 2 rocky pinnacles rising 10 to 15 meters above the escarpment ridge positioned northeast of the village of Isso. Like many other hills and ridges on Okinawa, these pinnacles were heavily fortified and honeycombed with tunnels impervious to artillery and mortar fire. Moreover, the Japanese defenders had carefully placed machine guns within these fortifications to cover all approaches and to provide interlocking fire that made any approach extremely hard. After realizing the pinnacles couldn't be taken by a frontal assault from the escarpment, Colonel Wynne ordered the 3rd Battalion to continue southward, while the 2nd Battalion was to apply pressure on the pinnacles by attempting a flanking maneuver. Thus, Companies F and G were detached from the rest of the battalion and moved along the base of the escarpment to bypass the east pinnacle, and from there they intended to turn west and scale south down the reverse slope near the village of Nakama. But the Japanese were ready. As the Americans emerged from cover, they were hit by a devastating mortar barrage and caught in a deadly crossfire from both Japanese positions on the pinnacle on their right and from Nakama on their left. Within minutes, Company F disintegrated as a fighting unit with all officers and most non-commissioned officers killed or wounded, and the remaining men fled in disarray, leaving Company G alone and exposed to the Japanese closing in from 2 directions. It did not take long before Company G met a similar fate. In the face of overwhelming Japanese forces, almost completely surrounded and under fire from 2 sides, the surviving men began a disorganized withdrawal back over the crest of the escarpment towards the relative safety of the 1st Battalion line. The 1st Battalion had only recently arrived from the Kakazu area, where it had been mopping up the rubble-strewn western outskirts of the Kakazu village before being rushed forward to hold the line in front of the Uraso-Mura escarpment. To cover their old positions, the 27th Division's reconnaissance troop was left behind. As a result, this area remained exposed and largely bypassed for most of the day. By the end of this disastrous action, the 2nd Battalion had lost 50 men killed and 43 wounded, nearly all from Companies F and G. Total casualties for the 27th Division on April 20th reached 506 men, the single highest daily loss suffered by any Army division during the entire Okinawa campaign. While the 27th Division continued its push south, the 96th Division maintained pressure in the center of the 24th Corps line. Throughout the day, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 382nd Regiment fought bitterly to secure Tombstone Ridge, finally wresting control from the Japanese by nightfall. Simultaneously, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 381st Regiment assaulted Nishibaru Ridge. Despite being raked by flanking fire from Kakazu Ridge and facing stiff resistance, the two battalions managed to gain a tenuous foothold on the northern slope of Nishibaru Ridge by day's end. In the 7th Division's zone of operations, the battle devolved into chaotic and costly small-scale engagements, often between platoons and squads, fought at close range. These skirmishes continued through the following day. After being halted in front of Skyline Ridge and the Rocky Crags, the division's renewed assault on April 20th yielded results nearly identical to the day before. The attack of the 32nd Regiment on Skyline Ridge began under intense mortar and machine gun fire, and quickly broke down into brutal hand-to-hand combat along the northern slope. In the grueling advance meter by meter, the Americans suffered heavy casualties, particularly among young sergeants and lieutenants who led their men, and whose exceptional leadership often cost them the ultimate price. However, once again, Japanese defenders entrenched on the reverse slope made it impossible to seize and hold the ridge's knife-edge crest, and for most of the day, the battle raged at such close quarters that both sides were so close that they could hear each other speak, and combat was mostly reduced to a hand grenade hurling contest. After an hour of savage fighting and several sharp Japanese counterattacks, the Americans were forced to withdraw, first to the base of the ridge and eventually back to their morning starting positions. To their right, the 184th Regiment's assault on Hill 178 fared no better. The assault companies quickly became bogged down in the open under relentless Japanese mortar and machine gun fire from the Rocky Crags and Skyline Ridge. With infantry pinned down in the open, only two flame-throwing tanks managed to push forward, clearing a handful of Japanese strongpoints. The lone success in this sector came in the afternoon, when elements of Companies G from both the 184th and 32nd Regiments, acting on the initiative of First Lieutenant John J. Home and Sergeant James R. W. McCarthy, both of whom were tragically killed in action, seized the summit of Uki Hill at the western end of Skyline Ridge. By evening, both companies had been reduced to about platoon strength each. However, despite their depleted numbers, this small advance party remained there through the night, repelling wave after wave of Japanese counterattacks, and losing both company and several platoon commanders. Just before nightfall, a platoon from Company F of the 184th Regiment joined the isolated group on Uki Hill, while tanks brought supplies to the men and half-tracks evacuated the wounded. On April 21st, as General Arnold, commander of the 7th Division, and Colonel John M. Finn, commanding officer of the 32nd Regiment, considered suspending further assaults on Skyline Ridge until Hill 178 was secured, the course of the battle shifted unexpectedly because of the bold initiative of a single soldier. That afternoon, Sergeant Theodore R. McDonnell, a chemical mortar observer from the 91st Chemical Mortar Company attached to the 3rd Platoon of Company E, grew frustrated by the stalemate and decided to take matters into his own hands. Acting on his own initiative, he grabbed a supply of grenades and charged up the slope and over the crest, assaulting a series of Japanese positions single-handedly. He made 3 separate trips back down the embankment for fresh supplies of grenades and ammunition under fire, and after each trip, he went back to clear more Japanese strongpoints on the reverse slope in an act of heroism that earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. Witnessing McDonnell's audacious success, Lieutenant Fred Capp, commanding officer of Company E of the 32nd Regiment's 3rd Battalion, immediately ordered his men to exploit the breakthrough. The company pressed down Skyline Ridge, and by late afternoon they had secured nearly the entire reverse slope, sustaining 2 killed and 11 wounded in the process. Over the next 2 days, the 32nd Regiment made no further push southward, but instead consolidated its hard-won gains, mopping up the reverse slope of Skyline Ridge and fortifying its positions. Meanwhile, patrols pushed onto Hill 178, securing it after a small skirmish against the few surviving Japanese defenders encountered there. At the same time, the 184th Regiment faced a brutal struggle for the Rocky Crags, where even the direct fire of a 155mm howitzer brought forward from Battery B of the 31st Field Artillery Battalion at point-blank range proved insufficient to blast a way for the assault troops or reduce the stubborn Japanese strongholds. Despite heavy casualties, the Japanese held firm for 2 days and successfully repelled repeated infantry and tank assaults. On April 23rd, the 1st Battalion of the 17th Regiment was committed to the attack, but by then most of the defenders had already been killed, while constant artillery shelling had brought both crags to the verge of collapsing. Meeting little resistance, the battalion advanced with ease, and by 10:30 that morning, the rocky crags were finally in American hands. Before they were secured, the tangled and broken terrain surrounding the rocky crags posed a substantial obstacle not only to the 7th Division, but also to the left flank of the 96th Division. Heavy Japanese fire from the rocky crags and the Tanabaru escarpment on the left and from Nishibaru Ridge on the right severely hampered the 382nd Regiment's advance on April 21st. Launching their attack at 7:20 a.m., the regiment struggled forward in a grinding meter-by-meter advance. By early afternoon, however, their progress was abruptly halted by a series of fierce Japanese counterattacks, which quickly escalated into savage hand-to-hand combat. Though the 382nd successfully repelled these wild assaults, the cost was high, and the regiment's advance for the day was limited to just a few hundred meters. By nightfall, heavy casualties had reduced the 382nd's combat effectiveness by roughly 50%. On April 22nd, the battered unit was relieved by the 383rd Regiment, while the 2nd Battalion of the 382nd, having been largely untouched in the preceding days, was temporarily attached to the 383rd and placed under its operational control. On the right flank of the 96th Division sector, at 6:30 a.m. on April 21st, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 381st Regiment launched a coordinated attack to seize Nishibaru Ridge and the village bearing the same name just south of the crest. After climbing the steep slope, they managed to clear the ridgeline, but they failed to secure the reverse slope and the village, ultimately ending the day in the same positions they had held the day before. By April 22nd, it had become painfully clear that the 96th Division had been locked in a brutal meat grinder. The cleverly concealed and often nearly invisible Japanese defenses rained death on the advancing troops. Throughout the day, American infantry crept across open ground under relentless fire, with casualties mounting, especially among junior officers, while the rugged terrain rendered tanks all but useless. Even when armor managed to overcome gulches and gorges and make some progress, the infantry was often unable to follow. On April 23rd, an armored bulldozer finally carved a path forward, allowing medium tanks of Company B from the 763rd Tank Battalion to advance and provide close support to infantry assaulting the Tanabaru escarpment. Even though the Japanese still held out on the high ground, it was increasingly evident that despite savage fighting and mounting losses, the relentless pressure from the 96th Division had brought the Nishibaru-Tanabaru line to the brink of collapse. On the western flank, the 27th Division spent most of the day consolidating its line and reorganizing rather than fighting. At the Item Pocket, which proved to be as troublesome as Kakuzu Ridge, the 165th Regiment was locked in a brutal battle of its own. On the Uraso-Mura escarpment, after suffering heavy losses, the 105th Regiment spent most of April 21st and 22nd repositioning and reorganizing, while responsibility for pressing the attack on the West Pinnacle shifted to the 1st Battalion of the 106th Regiment. But despite determined efforts, their assault on April 21st made little headway. Progress came only the following day, once engineers had cleared mines from the roads, finally enabling supplies and armored support to reach the escarpment. With self-propelled guns now in position, American forces began eliminating Japanese positions one by one at close range. Though some Japanese troops remained hidden on the West Pinnacle, the stronghold had largely been neutralized. That night, around 30 Japanese soldiers burst out from the pinnacle in a wild yelling banzai charge, only to be annihilated by the entrenched troops of the 1st Battalion from the 106th, dug in south of Isso. The East Pinnacle, however, proved far more difficult to take. After reorganizing, 2 assault companies from the 1st Battalion of the 105th Regiment, having relieved the battered 2nd Battalion, scaled the escarpment east of the East Pinnacle, following the same steep path used by Companies F and G 2 days prior. Upon reaching the summit, they found themselves face to face with entrenched Japanese defenders, and a brutal hand-to-hand fight erupted. In the close quarters, melee, bayonets, clubs, and grenades were used, and more than 100 Japanese soldiers were killed in under an hour. By the end of the day, the 27th Division had secured the escarpment as far east as the outskirts of Nakama. However, as the operation progressed, by April 21st, General Hodge and General Greiner became increasingly concerned about the widening gap between the 27th and 96th Divisions in the Kakazu area. With each passing day, this gap expanded, threatening the stability of the entire 24th Corps front. To make matters worse, there were clear indications that the Japanese were reinforcing the sector in considerable strength. That day, a reconnaissance troop attempted to enter Kakazu village, slowly fighting its way forward under fire, but was ultimately pinned down after advancing barely 50 meters. In response to the steadily worsening situation, on the evening of April 21st, General Hodge assigned Brigadier General William B. Bradford, the 27th Division's assistant commander, in charge of operations in the Kakazu pocket, granting him full authority to coordinate action with the 96th Division. At the same time, Hodge ordered his final reserve, the 3rd Battalion of the 17th Regiment, to move immediately from the 7th Division zone on the east to the Kakazu area, while the 3rd Battalion of the 381st Regiment from the 96th Division was directed to shift right. General Greiner, for his part, repositioned the 3rd Battalion of the 106th Regiment to Kakazu West and moved the 2nd Battalion of the 165th Regiment from its position near Makinato to the left of the 105th Regiment. He also directed the 102nd Engineer Battalion to assemble near Makinato Inlet as a division reserve and prepare to fight as riflemen if needed. Thus, by the end of April 23rd, this mixed force designated the Bradford Task Force, composed of 4 battalions from 3 divisions with supporting units of tanks, armored flamethrowers, and self-propelled assault guns, was ready to deal with Kakazu Pocket once and for all in an attack scheduled for the following day. After a rainy night marked by unusually intense Japanese artillery fire, April 24th dawned with a thunderous 13-minute American artillery barrage. Poised to unleash its full power against the remnants of the 62nd Division, the 24th Corps renewed its offensive spearheaded by the Bradford Task Force. Determined to fight its way through the Kakazu Pocket, Bradford Force surged forward at 7:30 a.m., but there was no one to oppose it. During the night of April 23rd to 24th, a heavy fog had settled over southern Okinawa, and under its cloak, while delivering heavy diversionary artillery fire against the American front lines, the Japanese had silently withdrawn from their remaining positions on the outer Shuri defense. All along the front, the Americans walked unopposed onto ridges and through villages from which relentless fire had once poured, now eerily silent, broken only by the occasional distant shell. Within ruined bunkers and shattered strongpoints lay the bodies of hundreds of Japanese defenders, while only scattered stragglers and a few last defiant shots remained. The outer Shuri defensive line had finally cracked, yet there was little rejoicing, as the price had been staggering. In just 5 days of fighting, the 24th Corps had suffered nearly 3,000 casualties. In the first 3 weeks of the campaign, the toll had risen to almost 6,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. And the end of the battle for Okinawa was still nowhere in sight. And once again, big thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Play War Thunder now for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile devices, and don't forget to click the link in the video description or pinned comment to claim your bonus pack, available for new and returning players that haven't played for at least 6 months, for PC and consoles, with the exclusive Eagle of Valor decoration, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. Don't miss out. This limited time offer ends soon.